Welcome back. I'm Frank Perri, and we'll be looking at the relationship between red-collar crime and workplace violence. I think that certain professions that I would characterize as anti-fraud professionals would find this segment of particular interests. For example, auditors, forensic accountant, fraud examiners, those individuals who are prone to coming across financial irregularities. Now, I want to start out with an example of how, in fact, being in a certain profession can be deadly in its own right. Consider a top prosecutorial fraud investigator by the name of Nazim Kaziak-Medov. This was a Russian. He was investigating certain financial groups. As he was coming out of a restaurant, he was confronted by an individual. He was shot twice in the chest and once in the head. Let's look at an American fraud investigator. His name was Al Vanda. He was investigating certain financial schemes that were being perpetrated on the Amish community. As he's driving to work on the highway, all 4 tires explode at the same time. Luckily, he wasn't hurt, but nobody was ever apprehended. Now, we need to understand that although there may be times where workplace violence may seem spontaneous or that we believe somebody snapped, that's not the case here. This is instrumental violence. It is planned violence. Okay? Now, let's look at a case of Michael Howell, who killed Sally Rohrbach. Now, Sally would be characterized as a state insurance investigator, basically making sure that the individuals who sell insurance are doing the right thing. In this case, Michael had embezzled thousands of dollars in insurance premiums. What does that mean? Well, his customers would pay him, but that they would not have coverage. Sally found out about this, and she even told her supervisors that, in fact, he was engaging in fraudulent insurance fraud. Now, once Michael started seeing that Sally was on him, he killed her by blunt force trauma. When the supervisor was interviewed about this homicide, she said, "Well, we saw this as a routine job. We don't believe that people in the field are going to be hurt. We don't think that people in the field can be exposed to this kind of danger." Let us move on now to the case of Erwin Margolis. Now, Erwin Margolis he appeared to be the president of what would be a jewelry company. It was called the Candor Diamond Company. He was engaging in what would be characterized as financial statement fraud. Now, in this case, he had 2 accountants by the name of Jenny Chin and Margaret Barbera. They knew about his fraud. While he was in custody waiting for his fraud case to be resolved, he participated in a murder-for-hire scheme, and he hired for $2,000 an individual by the name of Donald Nash. He wanted Jenny Chin and Margaret Barbera killed because of what they knew about his fraud schemes. Eventually, Donald killed Margaret, shot her. Luckily, he left a lot of evidence behind, forensic evidence that we had discussed earlier with the methodologies of violence. And he also killed Jenny Chin. But what's interesting in here is that Margaret, prior to her homicide, worried that her life was in danger. Now, as you can see from the few cases that I've been able to talk to you about, how is it that we can mitigate the harm to our well-being? And this is especially true for anti-fraud professionals. And it's been documented that individuals such as auditors at times have felt unease being out in the field due to how people are interacting with them in terms of how they are doing their jobs. What can we do? Number one, we ought not become lazy in our risk assessment simply because our jobs have a routine nature about them. Consider how the people that you are interacting with treat you. For example, do they violate your personal space? Are they argumentative with you? Do they make belittling comments to you? Do they blame you for the problems that they have on a financial basis? Moreover, consider the time of day that you engage in your job. For example, do you have to go to a remote location late at night? Are you telling other people where you're going? Are you willing to call law enforcement if necessary? And in addition, consider exit strategies. What do I mean? Well, if you're going to another location in another person's space, if something should happen, do you know how to get out of that location? These are but a few of the examples, and I would highly recommend that you consider other ways to reduce the risk of you becoming a red collar offender victim. Now, as you can see, this is a serious topic. Workplace violence is a serious topic. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen, and we'll be looking in more detail in our question and answer segment on the relationship between red collar crime and workplace violence. Thank you.
Frank, what can management do to make their employees feel safe and reduce the exposure to violence?
I think when it comes to management, first of all, they may have to be educated that, in fact, white collar offenders are capable of violence. In that, if we now fall back on the assumption and the speculation that white collar offenders are not capable of violence, that's a problem. But let's just assume that they understand that these risk factors do exist. I think that they have to show that they actually care about the problem and to let their employees know that they care. Well, how can that be shown? Through policies, for example. Many times, anti-fraud professionals have to go to remote locations, for example, like auditors. And there has been evidence that auditors at times have felt uncomfortable going to remote locations, especially in terms of how they've been treated. So if they can have policies in place on what their employees should do, if they should feel uncomfortable, who they should notify, that speaks volumes. Often policies are looked upon as an additional cost to a business, and we certainly understand that. But we're also talking about people's lives. And we have to understand also, as you recall in the one case of Sally Rohrbach, her supervisor said, well, you know what, it was a routine job. We don't believe that people in the field are going to be put in danger. If management can understand that, in fact, their employees could be put in danger and put policies in place and make their employees feel that they are looking after their interests, I think that will speak volumes, and it will help mitigate the risk of violence.
How can people navigate the power dynamics and boundary issues that are expected at a workplace where someone can't necessarily choose the people that are in their lives?
You know, that is an excellent question, and this is where at times can be problematic, in that is where our livelihood is at. What we have to understand in the workplace is that we often don't think that personalities can be abusive, but they can be. People can be bullied, and it does happen, especially in the context of white-collar crime, for example. What do I mean? That you may have high-level executives or management who are engaging in criminal behaviors, and they expect their employees to basically help out in what they're doing. And there can be under incredible pressure to conform. The answers are not easy in this case. If you're looking at a situation in which you are asked to engage in, for example, criminal behavior like committing fraud, of course, you shouldn't. And you can't make the argument that you were just following orders or that my boss told me to do it, all right? Because you can be held accountable no differently than the boss who is asking you to do it. At that point, individuals will have to make that determination of whether or not they leave or they stay. And if they stay, it could be a very uncomfortable situation for them, especially if you're a subordinate. It can be incredibly difficult. Why is that? Because if the type of corruption that's happening in a workplace is top down, well, who's going to listen to you if you are trying to be the ethical employee? You're, in a sense, going to be boxed in, and you're going to be looked upon as the odd person out. So that's a difficult situation. My advice would be, if you have the possibility of getting another job and moving on, that's what I would recommend.
In a workplace setting, how can one differentiate between someone that may just be a jerk or greedy versus someone that's potentially dangerous?
What I would share is this from the cases that I've seen. If you have a situation like Sally Rohrbach, I think it's difficult to assess the offender because that may be the first time you met them. All right. If you're in that kind of situation where you're going to say a potential client, and in this case, she's an investigator to go and examine a person for insurance, if that's the first time she met that individual, meaning Sally, then she may not know that person's personalities. But what I would share with you is that if there are certain traits that start to surface, then don't ignore them. For example, is the person aggressive? Is the person invading your personal space? Is the person, for example, starting to push furniture around or make belittling remarks to you or raise their voice? Or if you're in a remote location and you start getting calls late at night and people want to start asking you personal questions of where you live, those are red flags that should not be ignored, okay? In terms of, well, if you're in a work environment and you know these individuals, then I would have to say that if you are now feeling pressured or people are bullying you and they get the sense that you might be, for example, a potential whistleblower, then there's a problem. And at that point, you are at risk for being a red collar crime victim.
Thanks, Frank.